Why don't you follow and interact with us on social media at ZiFM Sport, or in our individual capacities at Chris Midzi, at Mike Madoda, at Sean Tafirenyika, at Barry Manandi, at Tatenda Ziambi, at Alois Bunjira. No, it's actually at Gazaman14 for Alois Bunjira. Why don't you interact with us on those platforms? So the big one, as I said earlier, is at ZiFM Sport. Right, let's give you that Warriors camp update, which concerns the boys who are based out in France. Now, according to reports this morning, ZIFA revealed they had secured a private jet for the French duo of Tino Kadewere and Marshall Munetsi to enable them to fly home for Zimbabwe's Africa Cup of Nations qualifiers against Botswana and Zambia. Most European clubs have blocked their foreign players from traveling outside the European Union during the international break, as they will need to be quarantined for at least 10 days upon return. However, the French government on Saturday opened the door for Kadewere and Munetsi and other foreign players in Ligue 1 and Ligue 2 to join their national teams after announcing that they will no longer be quarantined upon return. Now, subsequently, the Zimbabwe Football Association has tweeted on their official handle as a Tino and Munetsi update. They said, "We have engaged the Mozambique Football Federation, who have in principle agreed to assist us to transport the players back to France after the qualifiers. They might not be available against Botswana, but could be here against Zambia." And it's signed off spokesperson Gwesela. That, of course, is the ZIFA spokesperson, Olisani Gwesela. Michael, the proviso was that the French government agreed in principle on the basis that players would have to return on private planes. That's why ZIFA's had to run around and talk to Mozambique. Can this be done, or is it too much effort for these two players? Your thoughts?
First of all, Barry, I don't think it's too much effort because of the importance of those two players. They are two of our Europe-based players who offer quality and experience and are playing at a very competitive level. We have seen Marshall Munetsi, who is one of the more rarely talked about stars, Warrior stars, show what quality he has in big games that he has played, especially in the game against Lyon, where yes, Kadewere may have scored, but it was Marshall Munetsi who was actually man of the match and was picked in the Ligue 1 team of the week, and he has been picked on a couple of occasions as well. So these are two important players for the Warriors cause against two teams in which we're not guaranteed victory. Botswana are no mugs, they're no pushovers, they're playing at home. They took a point away from the National Sports Stadium, and they'll be looking to go one better, that is to win versus Zimbabwe, especially a weakened Zimbabwe, and a Zimbabwe whose preparations have been in disarray. They'll be looking to take advantage of that and get the points. But the one thing, Barry, that is critical is the fact that ZIFA have said that these two players might not be available for Botswana. We're already weakened. We're already missing the likes of Kama Billiard, who we could have done with in this game. And for us to be missing those two players who could have added the fear factor and the psychological edge to the game versus the Zebras is a blow that the Warriors are going to have to get over and play well to overcome Botswana.
Yeah, when you add to that list, Chris, of Kama Billiard, as mentioned by Mike, you add the likes of Marvelous Nakamba, you add Tendai Darikwa, the UK-based boys, they're not going to be available either. And there would have been almost a glow around the Warriors on the basis that would have EPL stars, Ligue 1 stars coming and descending upon Botswana. And then there's a weight about the Warriors. Right now, you've got to say to yourself that Botswana, who primarily have players who are applying their trade domestically in Botswana themselves, as well as in South African leagues of that nature, they'll be licking their chops and saying, oh, this is a good chance for us against the Warriors. And so, yes, I agree with Mike. It's not wasted effort by any stretch of the imagination. We should try to get the boys in.
We definitely need to try and get the boys in. It's almost like right now Botswana's looking at us and thinking, you know what, these guys are ripe for the picking right now. They don't have their key players in midfield playing out front as well. We don't have our key players, our regular starters, the players that we rely on. And we know generally on the continent, when it comes to the quality of football played, it's definitely not as high as your European leagues. So having those players, first of all, in terms of quality, presents that extra edge, but also just in terms of the weight of the Warriors as a team was going to be a major factor in this game psychologically against Botswana, and we no longer have that.
You know what, Barry? Whilst we can give ZIFA a pat on the back for the effort that they're making to get Munetsi and Kadewere in the country, there are questions that must be asked as to why this has become a logistical nightmare for the Warriors, especially if you consider that there really was no need to be hiring a private jet, to be going via, and for these players to be even late. There are flights right now out of Paris into Dubai, and a flight from Dubai into Harare that arrives in the capital every day at lunchtime. So I just don't understand what is happening when it comes to the management of the team. If we are preparing for these games, we knew of this date months ago. We knew what the circumstances around global travel were because they've been well documented, and people are harping on about you just needed to go to a travel agent and they would have told you that these are the conditions of travel, these are the areas of concern, these are the routes that you can take, these are the flights that are available, and we should have made our plans accordingly. Why has it become a nightmare?
And that nightmare is, and Mike, you're so right, because the proviso by the French government was for a return trip on a private plane. So there was no reason why we couldn't bring them home commercial and then return them using that Mozambican angle. The Mozambican angle, of course, coming up as a result of, we understand the Mozambican government, I think, has been able to avail or hire a private plane for one of their stars who are based in France. That star player being Reinildo Mandava, who plays for Lille out in France. So we're using a borrowed vessel to take our players back. No reason why we couldn't fly them commercial. I feel like one of those American generals, Chris, saying, bring our boys home. And that's what we needed to do.
That's what we needed to do. And like Mike said, they knew of this date beforehand. Plans could have been made. If it was indeed absolutely necessary for them to use a private jet, all that should have been organized ages ago. But we have a situation where the management, when it comes to these players, is not being taken seriously. The treatment of the players is not being taken seriously. Things like their preparation and their training is not being taken seriously. So all you can look to is the ZIFA management in terms of just, now we're expected to pull together a team and to perform and to qualify. But when in terms of preparation and actually managing this team, nothing is being done.
Can I just bring something up, guys? I know it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but there are those who are cynics who say that it also calls into question perhaps the commitment of the said players who are playing abroad, especially when you hear reports of other European stars who are doing so much and going all the way to make sure that they get themselves to where they're supposed to be, and even making plans for their less well-heeled teammates. You know, reports that Naby Keita has asked every Guinea international based in Europe to just merely make their way into Paris, where he's hired a private plane that will take them into Conakry and then back to Europe, and stories of that nature. And I know it's not their responsibility, but sometimes you have to go back to the days of Peter Ndlovu and the commitment that he showed, Bruce Grobela, the commitment that they showed, the investment at a personal level that they made into the Warriors. And you've also got to ask questions around the commitment levels of our Warriors.
Yeah, it's a pertinent question, because you've got players who, in truth, should be well capable of doing those same initiatives that Naby Keita has been conducting. So it begs the question. But I want to sort of dive into what Chris has just brought up, which is the management of the squad as a whole. You got to say to yourself, Mike, I'm sticking with you, that the training or the loosening up training session that was conducted by the Warriors on yesterday left a lot to be desired. They went across to Railton Sports Club, and that, I think, in a microcosm, was emblematic of exactly how this camp has gone, because that surface was not fit for purpose. The selection of Railton was called into question. So it begs the question, are we doing the right things for us to qualify?
A sham, a shame, and a disgrace, Barry. And anyone who has seen the surface that these players were forced to train on, I think it's a reflection of the standards that are at ZIFA. They're classless, they're standardless, and they place importance on things that don't really matter. They place more importance on power politics. They place more importance on staying in office than running the game properly. You have only one job. One job.
Literally.
One job. Okay? Yeah. And where do you go? You go to Railton Sports Club, which has been condemned even by boozers teams. Boozers teams will not touch it. They will not play on it. And that's where you expect Knowledge Musona, who's flown in from Belgium, a professional footballer in Europe, to train. Yeah. That's where you expect all these boys who are coming in from South Africa to come and train. It's an absolute disgrace, Barry. And to be honest, it also highlights the lack of facilities in this country. You and I had a conversation last night, and we were trying to count on one hand right now for a country that purports to be a football-loving nation. How many stadiums or fields right now are in decent nick? And you and I could only count the National Sports Stadium, Mandava, Baobab Stadium, Simbabora Stadium out in Shamva, and the Eagles Nest, which belongs to Golden Eagles Football Club. Outside of those 5 fields, Barry, 2 of which belong to 2 teams in Division 1, you name me any other surface right now that is actually football ready. The answer is probably no. And yet we've got more than 80 professional football teams in this country. We've got a whole football association, a whole Premier Soccer League, and yet we don't even have training facilities.
We don't even have training facilities. And for me yesterday, Mike, you talked about the fact that some of these players, in terms of their personal investment into the national setup, I feel as though part of the players become part of the problem, because they should have never agreed to train on that surface. It should have been highlighted very immediately that this was not a professional thing that they should have been doing. They should not have been training out at Railton, but they agreed. And in some ways, for me, that actually bolsters what's happening at ZIFA, because they say, you know what, the players are training anyway, the boys will just carry on, and that should never be the case.
I think that the fear, Chris, is around what they've seen happen historically. And sometimes they fear making a principled stand, because there's been a lot of victimization in years gone by when players have stood up for the right thing. Right now, one of the reasons why Matthew Rusike is no longer allowed in the Warriors' fold is because he fell out with ZIFA. He spoke up, he was critical, and then the likes of Omega Sibanda and the likes, of course, of Philip Chiangwa and Machana, who is still on the ZIFA board, did not take kindly to the sentiments and to the rebellion that was led by the likes of Matthew Rusike, the likes of George Chigova, etc., players who we no longer see called up to the national team. So I totally understand, Chris, what you are saying, and there comes a time, I think, where the players have got to say something. And if they're to make a statement, I think it can't be 2 or 3 players. It's got to be the entire squad, including the team captain, Knowledge Musona, the senior players. Everyone says that this is a standard that's not acceptable. That way, they cannot victimize anyone, because in years gone by, there's been a divide and rule tactic that has seen certain players now ostracized and marginalized from the national team.
Well, the summary, guys, is that ZIFA shouldn't be, at this stage of its existence, at this stage of its life, shouldn't be having to borrow training pitches, have to borrow vessels. They should have their own stuff. They've got an entire ZIFA village out there. Unfortunately, AstroTurf was ripped out, but they could have laid an entire pitch during this lockdown and had it available for the national team. Then it will be predictable that when the national team comes into camp, they don't have to sleep there, but they certainly can train there. So I think ZIFA needs to be walking towards that to ensure that Zimbabwe at least has a chance. Let's look at those chances, because Zimbabwe is in Group H and are second with 5 points, 5 points behind log leaders and already qualified Algeria. Now, with the top 2 teams from each group to qualify for AFCON finals, the Warriors will book their ticket if they beat Botswana and Zambia, fail to beat Algeria on the same day. Botswana Zebras have 4 points, while Zambia's Chipolo Polo are at the bottom of the group with just 3 points. So we sorely need a victory over Botswana, and if the result between Zambia and Algeria go our way, we could have qualified by Thursday evening. That's our hope, albeit that the preparations have been far from ideal.